Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this meeting tonight. Philip's book, Standard Operating Procedure, is, in my view, quite a remarkable book, and it's one which I urge you to A, read, and B, persevere with. It is a hard read. I think Philip would acknowledge that himself. But it is an extremely important book. There are very few books like this around, and they're very, very important. You may think you know enough about the events that began to unfold really in Abu Ghraib in Iraq towards the end of 2003. But Philip's book, Philip and Errol's book to be correct, for Errol Morris is the co-author, cast new and fairly profound light on those events. The book is based on more than 200 hours of filmed interviews which Errol Morris filmed for his film, Standard Operating Procedure, which won the Grand Jury Award at this year's Berlin Film Festival. The interviews with the US soldiers and contractors who worked at Abu Ghraib are both startling and disturbing. It's a deeply shocking book, I think, and raises many questions, some of which I hope we can begin to look at tonight. Philip, in case you don't know, is the editor of the Paris Review. He's a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, and also author of another quite remarkable book, We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed With Our Families, Stories from Rwanda, which was winner of the Guardian First Book Award, the National Book Critics Award, Circle Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. So without further ado, I want to move on into beginning to look at this book. And the obvious question, the first question to start with, Philip, is really, could you just begin by explaining the background to your collaboration with Errol Morris?
Happily, thank you. I'd known Errol for about 15 years or so, and we had a friendship that from time to time he would also say, well, we should work on this or we should work on that. Nothing really quite clicked, and then without anything about we should work on, he started sending me in the summer of 2006 transcripts, and I think he may have sent me a few clips, just video clips, of interviews that he'd begun conducting about 6 months prior with soldiers, American soldiers who'd served at Abu Ghraib during the fall of 2003 when the infamous photographs had taken place, and particularly with some of the people who had appeared in the photographs or the scenes that were photographed or who had taken some of those photographs. And he was still in the process very much of accumulating these. And he was even slightly cryptic in it, about whether he was making a movie. I said, "You making a movie?" He goes, "Well, I guess I am making a movie." I did not realize at first that he was saying, however, a movie won't contain all of this material. Can't contain all of this material. By then he had over 100 hours of interview on film. And they came to, the transcripts were over 1 million words, I realized when he started giving them to me. And he said, there should be a book. We started to talk about the book. And I felt, from the moment that I started reading these transcripts, that they were very familiar to me. Well, first of all, I was really struck by the voices of these soldiers. I was moved by them. I felt that they were something that I had not heard with my ears and with my reading eyes. I had not seen before. The voices of sustained narrative description of what it was like to be an American soldier in that war and in that prison by people who were disturbed, conflicted, in trouble, and troubled by the whole experience, who came at it from all of a sudden they differentiated themselves from, their voices differentiated them from this general notion of them. We have always spoken of them as the bad apples or the soldiers or, the MPs at Abu Ghraib, and there's this kind of notion which, of course, a half a minute's reflection, which most of us never gave it, would make us realize isn't true, that you have half a dozen or a dozen people who are directly involved in these photographs. Guess what? They're probably a very different one from the next and have different ways of experiencing and imagining what they think they're going through. And all of that was immediately evident. So I said I really would love to work with this material and that how are we going to do this? And the understanding we decided on was that it would not be the book of the movie or the movie of the book, that I would not sort of wait to see how he finished the movie, and he would not ask me to sort of write the book almost as a draft of the movie, but that we would each simultaneously work from this body of material, which was growing. So I was there then for the next half of the interviews, roughly. I mean, probably a little bit less than half, about 35 to 40% of the material was still to come. Lindy England's interview and re-interviews with Megan Ambuel and Sabrina Harmon, with Joe Darby, who was one of the MPs who turned in the photographs later to the investigators, with a number of these people, with some of the military intelligence interrogators who had gotten in trouble. All of those interviews were yet to come and to be filmed, and I didn't participate in the sense that they're on-camera interviews, and so he was asking the questions. Our agreement was that I could go back and revisit any of these people. I could talk to any of them. I never felt the need. These interviews, some of them lasted for 7, 8, I think the longest interview was 17 hours over 2 days. Some of the interview transcripts were longer than the finished book. I can tell you that a lot of them involved a lot of repetition, so editing them was not as brutal as it sounds, but it was a lot of work. And that's how we worked. We discussed it from time to time as we went along, but I don't think we sort of thought, well, there's never been a collaboration like that, where you take a body of reported material, and in the course of his investigation already by then, he had acquired from, most of these people had been through litigation. They'd been put on trial. Most of them had been convicted or in some way entangled in these investigations. They had lawyers. A lot of documents had been leaked. Freedom of Information Act document dumps existed on the web. They'd sort of vacuumed up, his researchers had vacuumed up a huge amount of paper that had been generated in the aftermath of the pictures being published. And I used that as well, in a way that wasn't available to the film, but was available to the book. Interviews with some of the characters who were still in jail, like Charles Grainer, who was the MP in charge of the cell block where these pictures were taken, usually called the ringleader. He's still in jail. Sergeant Frederick, his immediate superior, was still in jail and not available for an interview. But each had given extremely lengthy interviews to Army investigators that were both very self-incriminating and very revealing about the hierarchy there, and I was able to use those.
Can you, I mean, you've mentioned some of the names now, and that was what I wanted to come on to. Can you just begin to talk a little bit about who some of these people were? There are a number of names that come up fairly regularly through the book. I mean, there's quite a big cast, but in fact, the core group is comparatively small, and Sabrina Harmon, Joe Darby, Javal Davis, Jeremy Sivitz, and then Charles Grainer, Lindy England, and Chip Frederick. Those,
and Megan Ambuel.
And Megan Ambuel, sorry, that's the other one as well. Those are the main sort of, characters, if you like, in this story. Can you tell us a little bit about them in insofar as you can?
In the broadest outlines, they're a unit, which is the way that the military talks about all sorts of different sizes of companies and platoons and so on, but their unit, their company, is the 372nd Military Police Reserve Company out of Cresaptown, Maryland. And they basically are reservists. Reservists in the United States means that you enlist on a part-time basis. You go through an initial boot camp training, and then you become a weekend warrior, as they call them. You basically go for 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. And you hang out at your base, and you go through some drills, and you do some training, and you maintain your reserve duty status that way. People do it for a variety of reasons. Some of it is patriotism, some of it is many of them. There's a high ratio, I would say, of people who have military experience within the family, that they come from military families. In the United States, in the post-draft era that we live in, the Army is a kind of caste. It's a social class and a social caste. There are families that have military connections, and there are families that don't. And it becomes increasingly a self-limiting group and self-selecting group of people who belong to the military. It's a big problem. It's not something I explain or explicitly explore in the text, but it's kind of a subtext, is the extent to which you see a sort of social class there. This is Appalachia, essentially. They come from southwestern Pennsylvania, northern Maryland, and West Virginia. If you have a sense of that area at all in your head in the map, it's if you drew a compass point and circled around, it'd be in those areas. It's overwhelmingly white unit, very, very few blacks in the unit. And most of those were cross-transferred in, which basically means that at the beginning of the war, a lot of these, everybody wanted to be part of the war. When the units wanted to mobilize, they were out recruiting people from smaller units. Nobody had quite the numbers. You have to have a full complement of soldiers to go. And so they were going around and saying, like, we're getting ready to go. And people who wanted to go, who were in a less gung-ho unit or a smaller unit or one that wasn't going to get mobilized, would sign up. Charles Grainer signed up that way. So some of these people knew each other from these weekends. Some of them had seen each other over several years. Their previous deployments had mostly been to Bosnia. There'd been several deployments as peacekeeping type missions to Bosnia. Most of the kind of work that they'd ever be involved in was peacekeeping type work. They were not trained as military police for guarding prisoners, which is a specific training. It's called an Internment and Resettlement Operations MP. They were what were known as combat support MPs. Their task was largely logistics, transport, convoys, and some sort of kicking in doors and combat support missions to go along with infantry out into the field on action missions. They were mobilized in the fall of 2002. In the run-up to the war, it was clear that we were going to war. The president wanted to go to war. That was the reason we went to war, and that was why we were going, and it was going to happen. They knew that. And this unit actually was supposed to, you may recall that there was a time when we were going to go into Turkey, and we were going to send people into Turkey from the north, and others were going to come in from the south through Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And then they consulted the Turks, and the Turks said no. That was a last-minute thought to see what the Turks thought, and the Turks said no. And so all these people were sitting on ships in the Mediterranean. Our guys never had left Virginia. And they vary in their backgrounds, but in Virginia, two of our central characters, Lindy England, who was at that point 18 or 19 years old, she had a high school education. She had joined the reserves as a junior in high school, her second to last year in high school as a 16-year-old. She had some patriotism. She had some hope of getting, as many of them did, the support for college education that comes with military service. So there's that. There's the idea that this will be a way of getting out of the very limited circumstances that many of them were in. And she was married at the time. She had met Charles Grainer because she does administration, and when he transferred in, he was a Marine veteran of the Gulf War. He started flirting with her from pretty much day one, and as she put it, I suckered in around the end of February. She ended up falling in love with him.
She was married, is that right?
She left her husband at that point. She put in for a separation. Adultery is an offense in the Army, greater than sex with another soldier, which is also an offense. The whole thing is illegal, and in the Army. And so, I mean, one way of looking at it is, gee, there's this immediate kind of soap opera going on, which is also an immediate sign that within that unit, there wasn't a lot of discipline. There was already a breakdown in discipline. And a lot of the way she talks about boot camp and what she liked about it, and it's kind of interesting, is she liked the discipline and the structure and the sense of testing herself and passing that test. And as soon as she was in and mobilized and activated and everybody was sitting around restlessly wanting to be part of the war that had started and they were waiting for an assignment, there was this sense that everybody was partying, everybody was messing around, everybody was breaking the rules, that everybody was muddling, that the command structure didn't really work. And you could feel that that rulelessness was starting to infiltrate the mentality already. They were deployed finally right after the end of major combat in early May. They were sent to Hillah, which was about as close as it came to the kind of pre-war rhetoric of a town that was very anti-Saddam Hussein. It was an overwhelmingly Shiite town. A lot of the mass graves that you heard about being found of Saddam's victims in the immediate aftermath of the invasion were found right around that town, which was by the ruins of ancient Babylon. It was as close to a very warm reception as American troops got in the country. I mean, in a sort of collective, generalized, regional way, it was a good place to be. A troop, they were not heavily fortified. They were living in an old date factory. Nobody was shooting at them for the most part. They did police work. They were training the local police. They had a good war until in September, when they thought they were going home, that they'd done their bit. And everybody thought, like in Renoir's movie, The Grand Illusion, that they'd be going home like next day. You know, we're just going in, liberate the place, sweets and flowers, and home we go. We're taking out Saddam. We're not nation building. We're not occupying. We're just going to go. and we've done it. And they were very shocked then to find out that actually, no, they were going to be extended and extended, and they got sent to Abu Ghraib.
And when they get to Abu Ghraib, they come basically to a scene of almost complete chaos. They come to a prison which has been gutted. Almost all the prisoners who'd been there previously had been released by Saddam as sort of a last-ditch effort to curry a bit of favor and so on, and to maybe to fight the Americans, although that's not really very likely. And
he was a pretty clever guy, Saddam.
Pretty clever guy.
And he knew his country. And I mean, there was this prison amnesty in the fall of 2002. So as the war drums are escalating in Washington and it's clear that there's going to be an invasion, he suddenly releases all his prisoners. He does this having won re-election by 99 point whatever percent of the vote in it, running uncontested. And in a debt of gratitude to his people, he releases all the prisoners. Now, there are very few countries where everybody wants all the criminals let out of jail as a sign of thanks from their leader. And a lot of these people were criminals. A lot of them were also political prisoners. But he completely opened his prison system, unheard of. And there were, some of you may remember, there was some incredible photojournalism that came out of Abu Ghraib as these gates were opened. And these were the huge symbols of his power. It was really a gulag-like system. There was a big execution chamber, very busy at Abu Ghraib. All of this he dismantled. And I think he was, to some extent, he was playing it both ways. He was saying, you want freedom? You know, look, I can make freedom for you. So it was a little bit of a sop to the West, but it was more of a taunt. And all the jails then got torn open. And what he said is, guess what? It was like when Castro sent us all his criminals in the Mariana boat lift. You know, he said, oh, you want us to liberate people? Here you go. You can have, you know, the chronic criminals and the diseased, and we'll put them on rafts and you'll deal with them. And so Abu Ghraib was a wreck.
And you explain that very clearly, and that picture comes across very clearly. And then what you obviously begin to focus in on is what you refer to, and everybody refers to, as the hard site within Abu Ghraib, and where high-value prisoners were taken for interrogation by military intelligence. Can you just talk a little bit about that setup and how these military police fitted into that?
Abu Ghraib exterior wall contains 280 acres surrounded in this wall. So the prison grounds is huge. In there, under Saddam, there were 5 physical prison centers, each with its own sort of smaller perimeter wall, which were built according to sort of British-American designs by European contractors in the 60s. So they're familiar prisons. They're built on what's called a telephone pole design, and when they call it the hard site, it sounds like the place where you do hard things to people, but it's because as opposed to soft, as intense. It was a physically strong structure of rebar and concrete, and these were the prisons that remained sufficiently unmolested that they could be restored by the American occupation. Originally, they were restored by people looking at it for the CPA as possibly the prison blocks that would hold the prisoners of a new civilian criminal justice system in Iraq. It was not meant to be a military prison. That shifted as the insurgency surged through the summer of 2003, and the military had already set up a little camp for prisoners there in tents. That was growing, and military intelligence started to set up an interrogation center there, and at some point the MI, military intelligence guys, took a look at the hard site and said, that's what we need. It's got individual cells, particularly this one cell block. It's cell block 1A and 1B of this hard site was individual cells. And that's what you need, because when you interrogate people, you don't want them, when you're done with the interrogation, to go back and talk to their buddies and be sitting in a group situation in a tent or with other people. You want complete control over the interrogation environment, and that's totally correct under all.
They call it an inn, don't they?
Huh?
I think you refer to this idea of innkeepers and
yeah,
guests.
well, this is the sort of rarefied language that they use at Fort Huachuca, which is the military intelligence interrogation school out in Arizona. And they talk about, listen, when you are running an interrogation center, you should think of it as an inn. And your interrogation subjects are your guests. And you are the innkeeper. And you have your military police, who are the people who are essentially like your concierge and your maître d', and they're the ones who are going to go and you decide on the conditions. Now, again, you think of these sort of World War II movies. They're very fixated. I mentioned this later on, but the hero of the American interrogation trainees and the big guy that they're all obsessed with once they get through interrogation school is a guy named Hans Scharf, who was the master interrogator of the Luftwaffe in World War II. And Hans Scharf was a German who'd gone down to South Africa and married and happened to be visiting home in '39 when he got drafted. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that he was a pretty clever guy and also very suave. And he became known as this guy who, whenever American pilots were shot down, they were brought to him. And it was particularly Air Force that he ended up dealing with because he was Luftwaffe. And while his friends were pulling out fingernails and tying people up with barbed wire across the street, he never laid a finger on anybody. And he was, he'd give them little cups of coffee and filterless cigarettes and walk on gravel paths under linden trees and say, well, it's remarkable. I read in the New York Times yesterday that so-and-so squadron is stationed over there. Well, how is that going? And a little bit, I referred to it already, but the Grand Illusion by Renoir, that sort of gentlemanly code, where you say, well, how are things at Maxim's these days, And the idea was this ability to slowly soften people up, and that you have a cooperative relationship in which they don't even realize that they're downloading information to you. And of course, that requires a worldliness and a knowledge and so forth. Most of these guys who were interrogators were 18 years old. They're fresh out of boot camp. You put them into a cell with a 60-year-old three-star general under Saddam Hussein, who's like some ancient lizard who's survived everything. Imagine how wily and savvy and thinking in three directions at once you've got to be a guy who's survived under him that long. And so, of course, that guy looks at this interrogator and doesn't take him remotely seriously, and the interrogator feels it and feels intimidated, and so he wants to show who he is, and all he's got is force. He can't speak Arabic. He can't show his great intelligence. He can't talk about the books he's read. He can't, there's nothing there. And so that's this innkeeper and guest thing completely falls apart. All you've got left is this idea that you got to have complete control. And the interrogators are supposed to have complete control. And they've imported now, I had originally thought when I wrote this book I wasn't going to do anything about the policy, that I would just leave the policy as a given, that it was given that we had a new policy of torture, that's been heavily documented by now, that all of that came down from Cheney and Bush and Rumsfeld and the Justice Department characters, and I realized I had to do some of it. But none of these soldiers knew it. They didn't know that General Ricardo Sanchez, who commanded ground forces in Iraq, had issued special interrogation rules for Abu Ghraib prison, and that when he said how should they be implemented, allowing many of the things you see in the picture, the nudity, the sleep deprivation, the chaining and the stress positions, the use of dogs, all these different things, he had described it's the military police should be setting the conditions for the cooperative interrogation. And it was, they have euphemisms for everything. So this is called counter-resistance. The idea being you're dealing with some hardened terrorist. He knows how to resist your questions, so you have to break him. Hans Scharf had a quiet way of breaking them, and they thought that was great. But when it came to breaking them and they were told you can take the gloves off, that's what was going on. When they arrived at this hard site, our nice kids from Cresaptown, Maryland, and the not nice ones were suddenly assigned to be on the night shift guards for this place. When they walk in, they see the nudity. They see people in stress positions like Palestinian hangings trussed to the walls of their cages. They see people standing in puddles of water with panties on their heads. And they say, what's going on? And they are told, this is what military intelligence wants. This is what you are to do. Don't ask too many questions. Just do it. It's cool. It's what's happening on this cell block. Now, the cell block, you should know, there are thousands of people at Abu Ghraib. This is like 40 or 50 people, which is not to diminish it. It's just to give you a sense of the focusedness of this particular operation.
Before we go into that a little bit more, there's a couple of interesting decisions that you took in relation to the book, which I want to ask you to explain. The first thing is that you very explicitly decided not to reproduce in the book any of the photographs which we have all come to know over the years. And secondly, you decided not to use any of the real names of any of the Iraqis who were effectively tortured. Can you just explain that before we go any further?
They're related. So let me start with the photographs. When I thought about, I find the photographs really repellent. I find them hard to look at. I find them that they make you want to turn away. And I'm trying to figure out a way to tell the story in such a way that makes you look after you've turned away. Everybody's seen them, at least most of the people in this room look roughly the age that they would have seen them when they came out. It occurred to me the other day that people who are now, let's say, starting their university or college education, people who are 20, were 15 when those photographs came out, or 16, and may not have actually really registered them, and for them it's already entering history, which is startling and interesting. But these photographs exist. They're widely published. They're available on the web. They're available on the website for this movie. They're in the movie. They're there. So I wasn't having to weigh, do I withhold them or expose them? That had been done. And I felt they have so totally dominated our perception of this story. And they have, in the very first stories that were published about them, a lot of the time you'd see a sentence that said, the photographs tell all you need to know. The photographs tell the whole story. You know, a photograph is worth 1,000 words. And I beg to differ by writing 100,000 words. And I really think that what you saw, I felt when I looked at those photographs, all the disturbances one feels, but also I don't know what I'm seeing. I'm not exactly sure what I'm really looking at. What is happening to that guy on the box with the hood and the wires? Why is he like that? Why did they do that? You know, it's interesting to me to learn that the poncho that he's in, that cape, which looks like part of some sort of medieval humiliation, was actually put on a naked man because those were two extremely cold nights in the desert. And Grainer, who is usually described as the sadist, saw how freezing these prisoners were, felt himself to be putting on extra layers of clothing, and took this guy and cut a hole in a blanket and put it on him as a poncho. The pity ended there, but it's still striking to me that that's an explanation for these pictures. And I felt I don't want these pictures to be the defining frame. I want to create a context in which the pictures are situated. And I don't want to be arguing with them. I don't want to be bucking up against them. And I want you to be able to actually see it afresh. And so far, mostly I've been told people appreciate not having to look at them while they're reading this and knowing that they can. Not naming the Iraqi detainees by name, most of them had numbers. That was their official way of being known. They came to the prison and they were given a prison numbering system. Pretty quickly, on the ward, the soldiers gave them nicknames. This one's Gilligan, this one's Gus, this one's Claw, this one's Santa Claus. It usually had to do with some physical attribute or so, which of course, oddly, humanizes them, right? It takes them from being numbers and at least gives them a, you know, hey blondie, hey redhead, right? You know, it like at least makes them identifiable and real again, even as it keeps them at arm's length. None of them could master the Arabic names. And I felt, we have correlation sheets that show us the prisoner number and the prisoner name that have been identified. I thought, these people, we later find out, the Army itself says that 70 to 80% of them were there on wrong charges or without grounds. And I thought, why should I expose their names? They've been humiliated at length. They've had an ordeal. Who knows whoever reads this? Why should I, in any way, create a situation that might be a problem for them? And I wanted also to keep you inside the kind of claustrophobic experience of what it was like for these soldiers, so that I wanted those names to correspond to the kind of soldier's perspective. And it goes along with the same decision about the pictures. Just, there's no reason to expose them further.
Okay.
I do name one, and that's the guy who's killed.
You do, indeed, yes.
The one who's
correct.
killed. And that's almost the same principle, which is, he's killed, he deserves a name. These guys are alive and have to live with something that they have should not be their fate, or their only fate. I don't need to inflict it on them.
The pictures that you mentioned, the infamous pictures of the prison, were taken by different people for different reasons.
Correct.
Sabrina Harmon, for example, she says she took the pictures because she wanted to expose what was happening. That was what she says. And in the book, you say this about Grainer, one of the main protagonists, both as a torturer, actually, and as a photographer. You say, for Grainer, taking pictures was always explicitly an autobiographical project. He told Frederick and several other soldiers who served with him at Abu Ghraib the same story he told Lindy England about how his experience of being disbelieved after the Gulf War led to his idea of photography as a form of credibility insurance. So he used his camera to assert his presence. He wanted to show his hand. He also liked pranks and he liked to shock. And as he grew accustomed to the depravity of the military intelligence bloc, his standard for a scene that merited a photograph, something unusual or off the wall, kept rising. The question I want to ask you is, do you believe either Harman or Grainer?
Yeah, I do. I believe both of them. I actually tend to believe a great deal that all of these soldiers said, in part because a lot of what they said is extremely self-incriminating. And so, you know, there was that we actually had, I had some testimonies from prisoners. And again, I had no way, because I had no basis for looking at them, for encountering them. They read a lot, they've been translated, they come from Army investigations. They read an awful lot like this kind of weird generic victim speak that you get in human rights reports that makes for terrible literature and sort of makes victims strangely unsympathetic. And the fact is, it's always more powerful, if you want to hear about victimization, to have somebody's self-incriminating description of having done harm to somebody than having the person harmed say, that person harmed me. Unless they actually talk about the experience of having been harmed, which none of them did, and none of them could be found at this point, I found that much more powerful. Grainer came back from the Gulf War, the story goes, and he told it to a lot of different people, including people who reported it about him who don't like him at all, but certainly didn't seem to disbelieve him, like Joe Darby. That he came back from the Gulf War, he had some kind of a problem. A medical problem. I assume it's some kind of post-traumatic stress, some kind of combat vexation. I don't think it was a physiological issue specifically. And he went to the Veterans Administration seeking treatment, and they said, nah, you weren't there. Like, you weren't there in combat. Your unit, your paper, you know, you were such and such a unit. And as we all know, there's actually some room for somebody who's in a unit that officially is stationed here to have actually been sent over there on a couple of errands with some of his men, and it got rough and it got ugly and he got freaked out.
After all, Lindy England was not officially
Lindy England
on that block.
was not supposed to ever be at this military intelligence cell block. She was forbidden to be there by her status, and she was there as his girlfriend only, but she was there incessantly. So, you know, if the VA had looked at her paperwork, they would have said, no, you weren't on the military intelligence block. If there weren't any photographs, you weren't allowed. So Grainer, by the same measure, says he has these problems. And he tells people from the beginning, he always had his camera. Now, he definitely took photographs for a bunch of different reasons. From early on in his relationship, he took sexual photographs of Lindy England, which she had mixed feelings about at least. And I believe that, even though she went along with him, doesn't mean that the fact that she went along with him doesn't mean that she liked them. She wanted to please him. She didn't totally mind them. She thought, here's this 40-year-old guy saying, hey, I'm with a 20-year-old chick, check it out, and showing his friends. Oh, well, you know, she still liked him. He was charismatic somehow. Everybody claims that he was charismatic. People who hate him, people who like him. It's hard to fully grasp what that's about, but she does a pretty good job of articulating it. And he said, and this time, when I want anything that's off the wall or strange, is those quotes, anything that's unusual, I want photographs. I'm going to have proof. And without consulting at all with Sabrina Harman, with whom she wasn't particularly close, she kept using this word proof, that's what he thought of photographs as. Nobody took his word for things. Now, there's obviously something about Grainer that makes people think of him as some kind of bullshit artist, right? I mean, nobody ever believed him. So he looks at camera as, that's what I mean by credibility insurance. You don't believe me? There, see? That guy was there. He really was. You don't believe me that we did this to these people or that they had us doing these things? Here it is. So he's playing with this. He definitely used photographs to show to medics. He used them to show to Army lawyers. He definitely showed them to officers in the unit. Was he showing them to say, is it okay to do this? Sometimes he seems to have shown them to medics to say, is it okay to do, like we have something I didn't mention. These isolation cells were also used for the mentally ill. So in this prison population, there were no mental institutions running psychiatric hospitals in Iraq. And of course, there were people who needed institutionalization or who were barking mad. And they were rounded up. They were thrown in jail. Quite often, they'd be antagonistic to coalition forces. Hey, you, in jail. Then they were impossible in the tented camps. And they were sent over to these isolation cells where these untrained guards who already were busy condition setting for interrogators were suddenly in charge of people who hurled their feces, who spat, who screamed at night, and they had no support from the medics who, to the extent that they had pharmaceuticals for these conditions, had no experience assigning them. He would show photographs, the famous photograph of the leash. Lindy England holding the leash with the naked man. He used that photograph to show to the medics saying, well, this guy, we were told, was insane. He was naked in a cell, which is true. Grainer didn't put him there. He didn't strip him. We were told he'd been spitting and throwing things at American guards, telling them he was going to kill them all. I got a tie-down strap, a sort of cargo strap for a Humvee, made it a little loop and threw it around his shoulders. When he started crawling, it slid around his neck. I took this picture. Is it okay to get a guy out of a cell like that? Would you say that's medically okay? And they said, yeah, you know, under the circumstances, I guess. Nobody was keen on it, but nobody was saying, who knew what was real there, was saying that's a crime. So he used these, and I think he used them also because he was a clever guy. It's obvious he was a clever guy. He didn't always get approval exactly, but he knew he wasn't keeping a secret. Was he sometimes getting excited by what he was doing that was bad? Probably. But if he shows these pictures to the guys around him and nobody reproaches him, he has this feeling of complicity. Everybody knows. Everybody knows, and everybody's okay with it.
You're right. You talk at some point about the fact that the famous pyramid photo is used as a screensaver on his computer, which is the first thing you see when you walk into the block.
It's in the office of the military police there, the famous photograph of all these men stacked naked. These things were not hidden, and nobody's ever pretended they were hidden. I mean, well, people did pretend they were hidden when they were later trying to hide their own awareness of them. But at the time, it was in the open. Sabrina Harmon was training in civilian life to be a forensic photographer. That was her aspiration, to be a crime scene photographer. She came from a family of cops, and she had a great deal of comfort with dead bodies. She found them interesting to look at.
A morbid fascination, even.
A morbid fascination. I think she was very squeamish with the living, which is interesting. So, I mean, she almost like somebody who actually believes in souls. Like, once the soul's gone, like, it's just a dead guy. And then you can go and look really closely. She had an eye. We have photographs that she took that are completely banal when she was in Hillah, but you can see her sort of looking around a corner or looking down an alley. She had a searching eye. And she took the famous photographs of the dead prisoner who had been murdered during an interrogation, who had been laid out in an ice bags in his cell. And she went in there and pulled back the ice bags and pulled back the bandages that had been slapped on him as cover-up afterwards. And she created an entire documentation of this man's death that is the only evidence we have of a murder that's otherwise been covered up and not known. And she was writing letters home to the woman she called her wife, her lover, her longtime partner, from the prison, describing many of the scenes. And she ricochets in these letters between saying, you know, I walked in and I thought it was funny, they were jabbing at this guy, and then I thought that's molestation, and I took pictures, you got to see these pictures. And then a little while later she says, actually, I'm taking pictures now more and more because I just want proof. I want people, nobody would ever believe it. And this is what she said in her interviews over and over. Nobody would believe it. If I came up to you and I said, you know what they're doing in there? They're like stripping guys naked and poking at them with sticks and you know, making them stand there all day and having girls laugh at them naked. And you wouldn't believe that. You'd say, nah, that's not what they do. You're exaggerating. You're hysterical. And so she took these pictures. If I showed you a picture, you would have no choice but to believe it, she said. And her first photographs for the first week or 10 days of photographing are, none of them show soldiers in the frame. And they have much more the quality of photojournalism. Somebody walking down a hall and going, click, when they pass a cell door. Look at that guy in there, chained to his cell. Look at that guy. They're incredibly sad, lonely, kind of bleak pictures. They're in some ways much more shocking when you take time than the pictures that show jeering soldiers who are obviously posing. Because these have no pose, they have no attitude, there's no game. They're simply, and the term that she used over and over, I wanted to show what was allowed. Does that mean she never got into it? Of course she got into it. Does that mean that disqualifies the fact that she was also shocked? No. People can be both.
Just to come back to this point about the extent to which the abuse that was taking place on that in that hard site was known about, the Red Cross certainly knew what was going on. They were able to visit and to form a fairly clear impression of what was taking place. Was it reasonable for those involved, I'm talking about Grainer and England and all the rest of them, to think that what they were doing was legal? Some soldiers say they reported what was happening, but were ignored by senior officers. In those circumstances, did the soldiers have any alternative?
Well, there is a rule in the American military that you are not only allowed but obliged to disobey an illegal order. And there's something called an open door policy, which is that any soldier is supposed to be able to go to his superior officer and make a complaint about an order that they think is wrong or blow a whistle on these things, which sounds great in theory and is great in theory, and in an ideally disciplined and working army without any of the pressures of being, we haven't even mentioned that Abu Ghraib was in the heart of the Sunni Triangle. It was in the middle of a combat zone. That alone makes it illegal as a place to hold prisoners under American military doctrine, under international law. It was under incessant mortar attacks. Soldiers were killed and prisoners were killed, just going about their business as mortars came in over the wall. They would literally fish in a barrel at Abu Ghraib. So they were afraid. People had the jitters. They were outnumbered massively. The number of soldiers barely rose over the period of these 3 months, while the number of prisoners doubled and doubled again. Into the thousands. There were constant riots. The food was terrible. They were feeding people with local contractors were providing the food, and they were basically like dumpster diving around Baghdad and rounding up this garbage from the restaurants and just bringing it out to the prison. Some days they never even showed up. And people were getting killed on the roads outside the prison. Convoys were being under attack. So they had a lot to be stressed out about. So under those circumstances, with incredible pressure from the command structure outside the prison and inside the prison, we need actionable intelligence. We need to break the back of the insurgency. Everybody is being told, you're doing an important mission. Come down on these guys hard. It's not clear what an illegal order is. If you go and you look at the memoranda that circulated from the president, the vice president, the Defense Department, and so forth, it's pretty clear that there was a deliberate attempt by the lawyers, that there were, not an attempt, a deliberate program to decriminalize, redefine torture, to exclude large classes of people, including everybody at Abu Ghraib, from full coverage of the Geneva Conventions. There was an attempt to sort of legally, they lawyered up. They didn't just break the law. They tried to change the law. And they tried to create a situation in which this was what was expected. The soldiers had no clue about this. They never saw any of these documents. They never knew what the rules were. But as you look at those rules and you look at those soldiers, it corresponds exactly. Does that exonerate them? Not entirely. Did they object vigorously and get slapped down? Not exactly. Soldiers aren't really, theirs is but to do and die. There's not to wonder why. There's their job is, of course they sometimes say, you sure we're supposed to be doing this? Is this okay? And if somebody says, yeah. Grainer at one point had a habit of, he liked to walk people with hoods on into walls, right? Just to kind of, when they were disoriented, just keep, you lead them down the hall and bang, into the wall. So he was doing this one day with a new prisoner who started bleeding out from underneath his hood. His captain was there, a guy named Captain Brinson, who is in civilian life the aide to a Republican congressman from the South and his liaison to the Armed Services Committee. So a guy with a public career. And there were also some JAG lawyers, military lawyers, who were there, who were often on the hard side. And so this captain thought, I should do some paperwork just in case anything comes out of this incident. And he filed what's called a counseling report. And a counseling report normally is a bit of a reprimand, right? It suggests that you need counsel. And it sort of says, soldier, looks like you were under some stress, Instead, it starts, Corporal Grainer, you're doing a fantastic job here. I print the whole memo because it's really kind of shocking. And it really affirms what they were saying. You hear the soldiers saying, oh, everybody said it was okay. When you actually see this document that says, Corporal Grainer, you're doing a terrific job. This is an incredibly intense mission. It matters hugely to the success of this crucial campaign that we're on. And we have many commendations of your performance by Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Jordan of the Military Intelligence, particularly here on the cell block. There was an incident, a prisoner got wounded. We have no reason to question your account of this thing. Keep up the good work. And if you're stressing out or you need any help with the rules, you know who to ask. You can go to the chaplain for counsel, but carry on, sorry, Corporal. Rough stuff.
Yes, it does sort of, for the reader, it does present problems. You want to believe that there is an explicit, bad guy or bad psyche or something like that is doing all this. It's quite hard to get a grip on that, and I think that comes across, this is not a criticism, by the way. It's just a fact. I think it's a fact, and I think you reveal this, and I think that's why the book is quite important. Those involved in taking the pictures suggest in their own words that many of the pictures look far worse than they really were. The man on the leash photograph, there's an argument, there's an excuse for it. The crucified man photograph, there's an excuse for. And at the same time, of course, we know that people died under torture at Abu Ghraib. Based on what you've discovered in writing this book, do you think it was worse than it was portrayed or better?
Worse. I mean, you just described it very well, that one of the reasons it's uncomfortable to hear that the story of the guy, the picture of the guy on the leash or the picture of the hooded man look worse than they were. And even some of the more horrendous pictures of naked men being made to crawl through puddles. You know, there's a military intelligence guy, this guy Roman Kroll, who was Russian by birth, who was involved in that. He got convicted for a year for splashing water on a naked guy in this incident because he shows up in a photograph. And he says, you know, it looked so, he said, when I got home and I'm sitting in my leather couch watching my big screen and these pictures flash up, I'm like, that looks insane. And then I think I was there. It didn't look that bad. It just didn't, in that place at that moment, it just didn't look like the worst thing that could happen to a person. And I have to believe them. I mean, I have to think that, you know, when Sabrina Harmon says the first day you walk in there and you see naked people and you think, you know, this is crazy. And the next day you see naked, hooded people being made to crawl around and you think, well, it's not so bad to be naked if you're not being hooded and crawling around. And the next day you see a dead guy and you think, you know, it's not so bad to be have some woman laughing at you when you're naked. I believe that. You know, the process by which people become desensitized and inured in the process of dehumanizing the people they're dealing with is pretty well established, and it's not, it takes a pretty vigorous moral psyche for a young person who submitted themselves to that level of authority in that kind of a situation in the first place to resist it. But I think that the photographs from Abu Ghraib largely show the sort of nicer face of our torture policy. The soldiers often say, that's not torture, that's abuse, that's humiliation. Yeah, it's abuse, it's humiliation. We were humiliating them, we were softening them up. Women were deliberately meant to be there. Part of the policy was to have women standing around. There was a lot of, the Army behavioral psychologists put out these documents on the Arab mind. Arab mind is a mind fearful of dogs and that dislikes being paraded naked by its captors.
As if men.
You may feel some affinity with this Arab mind. Many of these soldiers, on reflection, said that they didn't really like the idea of being paraded naked by their captors either. But it was generally assumed that it would be much, much worse for the Arab mind if there was an American woman soldier standing there laughing at them when they were paraded naked. It never seems to have occurred to anybody except some of these women that this also meant that these women were being abused, that we were abusing American women soldiers by turning them into instruments of sexual humiliation. The women it occurred to, but they also were very much caught up in this complicated thing of wanting to be tough. And they talk about that, you know. Sabrina Harmon says, I wasn't tough enough. I failed the toughness test. Every time I had a moral objection, I felt like I was failing the toughness test. I'd been in boot camp and I was told to toughen up, it's war. Maybe I wasn't patriotic enough, she says at one point, which I found kind of, you know, helps understand the confused mind that's in this situation, wondering what's right and what's wrong. Well, and I think that much worse, you know, this guy was killed. There's a guy, I quote, Stu Harrington, excuse me, who is, he was a veteran of the Phoenix program in Vietnam where we bumped off large numbers of Vietnamese, and he ended up being a big intelligence operative for many years afterwards. And he was brought over briefly to visit the prisons in Iraq by his former student whom he'd taught, who was now running military intelligence in Iraq as a general, and she'd sort of said, look, I'd like you to come over and just look at these operations. We're not getting the intelligence we want. What are we doing wrong? And he went to Abu Ghraib. He said it was a nightmare. You know, first of all, everybody was unprepared. It was a hellish situation. It should never have been there. It was all wrong. And he said, but when I was there, and even when the photographs came out, he thought, what I saw that was sanctioned abuse was over at Task Force 121's headquarters at Camp Nama. This is one of the manhunt operations that was sent out to kill Uday and Qusay Hussein and others. There, he said, that was officially sanctioned, CIA proper, beat them up. But as you look deeper into what was going on at Abu Ghraib, a lot of people were getting beaten up too. And the dogs were biting them. And that's much more shocking than the sexual stuff, even if it's less sensational.
In fact, I mean, I think your book makes that point very strongly. I mean, I got the distinct impression reading the book that there were actually theoretically, there were no limits to the mistreatment or the mistorture.
You weren't supposed to kill people.
Well, okay,
and that was stated sometimes.
That did happen,
do anything but kill them.
I mean, it's interesting. You say at the beginning of chapter 14, and it's quite interesting to read this. You say, surely, if you've come this far in this sordid tale, you must crave some relief, some release from the relentless, claustrophobic annihilation of the dungeon. A clear and cleansing note of sanity, an interlude of avenging justice, or an eruption of decency, the entry of a hero. But surely you don't want to be deceived. There is no such solace or sanctuary in this story. Abu Ghraib was Bedlam, and the MI block was its sick, racing heart. Now, we know already that many of the prisoners that went through Abu Ghraib were not on the books. They were not booked in and out. They were black, if you like.
Well, in the hard side.
On the hard side.
There was a category of, and there were about, as I said earlier, there were about 40 to 50 prisoners there. At any given time during this season, there were roughly 10 to 12 of them, I mean, you know, as much as 25%, in other words, who were called ghost prisoners. And they were generally CIA prisoners or other clandestine task forces who were brought in without any identification, any arrest papers or anything. They were sort of warehoused there. You know, hey, we're going to just put this guy in this cell for a night or two, use this place to interrogate him and take him away.
Well, I mean, just to come back to this point, I mean, I think that when I was reading this, an uneasiness overcame me when I was reading these parts of the book. Because as I read the accounts of what was happened, okay, it was, you know, it was not drills. I mean, it was occasionally cigarettes and stuff like this, burning flesh and so on, but it was not the terrible things that one necessarily associates with the terrible stories one reads about, you know, Nazi concentration camps.
It wasn't
or whatever.
It wasn't Abu Ghraib
but
under Saddam Hussein either.
No, it wasn't. But
the
feeling one gets is that it was on that road. There was very little to stop it becoming that.
Yes, and I suppose that's why, on another uncomfortable note, I sometimes think these photographs were a great public service. When we saw them as some kind of, it was very easy to look at these photographs and say, taking those photographs is sick. It's obvious that, I mean, the smiles made them incredibly hard for people. The idea that that they were obviously an element of what was in those photographs was not expose, but trophy taking. And that the mixture of Grainer taking pictures of his girlfriend and him having sex or posing in front of places or just, you know, goofy pictures, soldiers mooning each other, soldiers standing, you know, giving the finger to Saddam's poster as they took over Iraq, soldiers pretending to hump a camel, you know, by like shadow pictures. Those kinds of pictures segue as they move from Hillah. And those pictures are like goofy pictures. These are kids in a really scary situation looking for release and sometimes a little drunk. And they move to this genuine hell where they are given a genuinely hellish task and they are scared silly. And they start to mix these two impulses. The slightly documentary impulse, like, would you believe what we're being asked to do? You got to check this out. Gets mixed in with the like, hey, stand over there. You know, hey, why don't you stand next to him? Why don't we take a picture of you laughing at him? Get in there close to the naked guy.
And guys who were not even on duty would come over for the night to spend the night bellowing at prisoners. Extraordinary things.
Because they had a lot of aggression that they had no other particular release for, I can also say. I mean, you know, here things were allowed. As Sabrina Harman said, it was allowed. Imagine that at the end of the day, I mean, if you set up a bar in London where you could go and just like punch people, right? And particularly punch the kind of people that you were told on a repeated basis were trying to kill you and would if they had a chance. I think it would not be an unpopular place, you know. And it doesn't mean that like you wouldn't even need a policy, you know. All you'd have to do is say it's allowed. Guess what? You know, on the way home, you can go home to your scary, sad corner, or you can go have a pop with your friends and punch a guy a couple of times, call him a name, and then go home. People weren't sleeping very well. There were mortars falling. I'm not saying this by way of saying, you know, people. That this is okay, or that, you know, because I somewhat get it, I'm approving it, or excusing it, or diminishing it. I'm saying, I think that the people who put untrained soldiers into this situation knew that this is what soldiers are capable of. That's why armies are instruments of discipline. That's why armies take aggression and the young and channel it. And that's why as soon as you have a breakdown in that, and a deliberate breakdown, where you create license rather than containment and channeling, you're culpable. You, the commanders, are culpable. And I think the fact that you took untrained soldiers, some of that was probably just due to bad planning, that they didn't have trained soldiers available, but it certainly served the function and the intention very well. Because you don't have to unprogram people who've been trained and grown up under Geneva to unlearn Geneva and to go against their own grain. You take people who have been basically told, hey, it's war, go for it. Things happen in war. Guess what happened in Vietnam? You know, remember your uncle and his box of ears? Right? Don't worry about it. And, which is true, but it wasn't policy in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it was kind of policy sometimes to look the other way, but it wasn't policy to have the vice president and the president and the Justice Department and everybody else trying to pass bills through Congress legalizing this stuff. And that's the real gigantic shift, is that you have a deliberate attempt to create a legal structure for it. And it also goes to where journalistically this story is weird, since we're here at the Frontline Club, which is part of the idea of an expose is that it should shame those who are exposed. Just like when you stripped these prisoners, you were trying to shame them and make them say stop. Instead, we had an administration that pushed back, that said, yeah, well, you know, a little dunk in the water. We ought to be doing these things. We need to do these things. These are terrorists. These terrorists, they'll kill you, you know, that kind of stuff. And there was a total pushback. There was no admission of shame. And all they would do is say, it's shocking, it's disgusting what these depraved individuals did in these sick photographs. And the photographs, which were an expose, quickly became instrumentalized as an instrument of cover-up. And it became, if it's not in the photographs, it's not happening. It's all those photographs, and it's the photographers, and the act of photography, the act of depicting, got confused with the acts depicted. And this sort of notion that, like, come on, it's sick to take pictures of this and to smile for it, glazed us. That and the tabloid story and the love triangles and all the sensationalism and the sexual pornography of it allowed people a kind of way off the hook and not to feel themselves implicated and not to have to look at this as national policy. But it allowed both politicians and anti-war people to kind of look at them as the demons and push the demon aside. And we ate that, we drank that Kool-Aid a little too readily.
Well, I think your book does an admirable job of really making you think very seriously about actually what was happening. And the decision not to put the photographs in was absolutely critical to that, actually. I don't believe it could have worked so well with the pictures in the book. We're going to have to wind this conversation up to some degree, because I want people in this audience and anybody else who may be out there in internet land to have a word. Just really to finish the discussion as we've had it so far, at the end of the book you outline what happened to those who were involved in the events at Abu Ghraib. I mean, what legally happened. You know, the psychological state is another matter altogether. And you go through some of the charges and some of the convictions that happened to a small group, the ones we've been basically talking about. But you say, at the end of the book there, you say, no soldier above the rank of sergeant ever served jail time. No civilian interrogators ever faced legal proceedings. Nobody was ever charged with torture or war crimes or any violation of the Geneva Conventions. Nobody ever faced charges for keeping prisoners naked or shackled. Nobody ever faced charges for holding prisoners as hostages. Nobody ever faced charges for incarcerating children who were accused of no crime and posed no security threat. Nobody ever faced charges for holding thousands of prisoners in a combat zone in constant danger of their lives. Nobody ever faced charges for arresting thousands of civilians without direct cause and holding them indefinitely incommunicado in concentration camp conditions. Nobody ever faced charges for shooting and killing prisoners who were confined behind concertina wire. And nobody has ever been held to account for murdering Al-Jamadi in the Tier 1B shower, although Sabrina Harman initially faced several charges for having photographed him there. That is an extraordinary statement.
I'm afraid it fact checks.
It fact checks, absolutely. If we break now to allow people here to ask any questions that they can, if you'd like to ask Philip any questions, please.
I think you were saying at the beginning that you mostly used transcripts and taped interviews where presumably you were not present yourself. did you find that was an impediment at all in understanding the context or like hearing even the questions that the people were asked during the interviews? Did you actually go back and interview any of the people in person yourself? I'm not saying this is a bad thing.
No, I know. There are two questions. So the first question is, did I find it an impediment? And I didn't simply work from transcripts. I worked from a mixture of transcripts, which included the questions. Of course, those transcripts belonged to filmed interviews, so I could actually look at them, which oddly, at times allowed me more, and perhaps more than I wanted, to be able to revisit a full interview than I'd ever had just as a print journalist, without a camera, because you go back and actually, replay and replay and replay, looking at this face, somebody saying something, which I really didn't do much of, but I found it interesting now and then. I could always throw up the person talking right on the screen. And then I was there for about half of them and sort of participated, not directly by asking because they're filmed and so there were Errol's interviews, but I would speak with him while he was doing them. I didn't actually end up going back because I didn't find it an impediment. There was so much material and it was so rich and the interviews were sufficiently exhaustive and thorough and covered. I might have had more questions, but it would have created yet another massive material to deal with that I felt like constraining myself to that was hardly constraining myself. So that worked out very well. And that's the impediment question. And the other is whether, remind me, okay, if you forget it.
Could you always, like when you were reading the Army transcripts, I think you said, the questions were always there as well?
Yeah, the questions were there. Charles Grainer and Sergeant Frederick, who was his immediate superior. Grainer was the MP in charge of that tier, the MI block on the hard side at night shift. And Sergeant Frederick was the MP sergeant in charge of the entire cell block, which included some civilian cell blocks as well, and therefore was his immediate superior. They were both still in jail. Both of them, when they were sentenced, part of their sentence included an order by the judge to cooperate with the so-called ongoing investigation by the Criminal Investigation Division of the Army, their special agents, with immunity from any risk of further self-incrimination. So basically, this grant of immunity meant say whatever you want. And in these transcripts, they go on, they're 250-page interviews each. They include all the questions. And they often describe beatings and so forth that they administered to prisoners much more vividly than anything else I've come across. And even more vividly than many of the prisoner transcripts. Because they were like, well, I don't really like talking about it, but the judge told me to, and here I am. And there was this kind of coming, not clean, but this slightly blunt, antagonistic, here's how it is tone that comes through in those. And their voices are very distinct. They were reasonably well transcribed is all I can assume. And so they sort of emerge as characters in their own form.
Next question. Person there? Yep.
Thanks. I'd like to ask two questions, if I may. Mention was made of the Red Cross knowing about this, but I think that got lost at some point. The other question was, I can't quite remember her name, but was the General Karpinski?
Yeah.
I think she was disciplined. Did you interview her?
Yes.
Did you
Errol
find
did.
her culpable in any way?
Why don't I start with Karpinski and then I'll go to the Red Cross because they fit together. Karpinski was the general who was in charge of military police. She was the military police general in charge of detention operations in Iraq at the time. So she wasn't just responsible for Abu Ghraib, though that was the single largest prison. Errol did, actually, his first interview for this whole project was with her, and it was a 110,000-word transcript. It was an endless thing. Janice Karpinski's basic claim is I didn't know what was going on. She was a general, but she was never faced with a court-martial. She was disciplined, she was reprimanded, her career came to a halt. And there are some others at rank like that they get their pensions and everything, but they're not going to advance.
She was reduced in the ranks.
She was reduced in the ranks. She became a colonel again. And she was humiliated somewhat publicly, though her public visibility was largely heightened by her own outspokenness. I mean, I'm not sure how publicly humiliated she would have been if she hadn't gone around saying I was publicly humiliated, is all I mean, because nobody was really paying attention. And she claims she didn't know what was going on and that she was cut out, and she sometimes said because I was a woman and so forth. I don't believe it's because she was a woman past a point, because the general in charge of military intelligence in Iraq, Sanchez's number 2, was a woman. Carolyn Wood, who was in charge of at least one aspect of the interrogations at Abu Ghraib, was a woman, and she kept getting promoted and never got in any trouble. I think the problem with Janice Karpinski is she was a reservist MP officer who wasn't part of the crew. She wasn't an inner circle person. And so when the shit started hitting the fan and they were looking to figure out how to handle it, Sanchez immediately commissioned an investigation of the military police, never of military intelligence. And that became the famous Taguba report. But the whole investigation began at the beginning, focused on this unit, starting on November 1, which was even after they'd arrived and after a bunch of military intelligence stuff had gone on. And it focused on her. And she definitely was scapegoated and screwed. But she also, the argument she has that she didn't know what was going on is a little bit a version of what a lot of the others say later. And it seems to me that if they didn't know what was going on, with the highest value detainees being held under interrogation in this crucial intelligence operation for gaining actionable intelligence to break the insurgency at the heart of our big war on terror, that's outrageous. They were supposed to know what's going on. If you're a general and you have no clue what's going on, I'm not entirely clear past a point how that's an excuse. It may not make you guilty of the abuses. The Red Cross first visited Abu Ghraib in this period. The Red Cross, under the Geneva Conventions, is the organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Swiss arm of it, goes into prisons and visits the prisons and monitors conditions and then gives reports. They went in first in October. They immediately found all these naked prisoners on the MI block and called off their visit, summoned prison authorities and said, what the hell's going on? And the prison authorities gave those people clothes and they came back and continued their visit and continued to find people with abraded wrists and stories of being held naked for long periods of time in windowless cells without any facilities. I don't know if they had beatings, but they described circumstances tantamount to torture and severe physical and psychological affliction amongst these people. And they reported this. Now, I use the analogy of Swiss banks. The Swiss Red Cross works like a Swiss bank, strict confidentiality of the client. So they only report to the government that's causing the problem. So they went to Theresienstadt during World War II famously and reported to the Nazis that there were problems. And the Nazis thanked them for their report. And nobody in the world heard about it from the Red Cross until later. That's the egregious, famous moral compromise of the Red Cross, but it happens in many little small ways over time. The deal is, what dictator's ever going to let them in otherwise, and they work in the interstices. So they go to this prison and they file a report to Janice Karpinski because she's the general in charge of these operations. She takes this report and hands it to Colonel Mark Warren. Colonel Mark Warren is the legal advisor, the lawyer in charge, to the general, Sanchez, who's running the operation in Iraq. And Mark Warren actually wrote for the general the rules of interrogation that allowed a lot of this stuff. He says, why, this is outrageous. Because, of course, even the lawyers who wrote these rules, I'm not sure they fully understood what they were writing. They knew they were creating license, but I think that when they were working in such a world of euphemism, that when they're suddenly confronted with this, they think, why, that sounds illegal. That's not following the safeguards we put in place, is it, right? So he says, is this possible? And he calls his JAG. JAG is the Judge Advocate General's office. It's the military lawyer division. He calls the JAG lawyers at the prison, MI, and they say, this is fantasy. It's a total exaggeration. It's completely nuts. This is all in a sworn statement he gave Army investigators. So he writes a letter, which goes out on Christmas Day, nicely, under Janice Karpinski's signature, saying to the Red Cross, this is nuts. This is like a fantasy. Like, we're quite confident that these aren't problems. However, Colonel Mark Warren is also involved in early January, just before the investigation begins. The Red Cross comes back for another visit. What does the Red Cross, what does the Army do in response to that? They go in there and they start scurrying around and hiding ghost prisoners. All the MPs talk about times when dignitaries were coming through where prisoners who had taken their mattresses and their clothes away would be given them back for the day. The MPs thought this was a big pain in the ass. The dog and pony show for the mucky mucks again. They didn't think like I'm covering up a crime. They just thought it's this, it's this thing we do. Because they were in a pretty closed system.
But one thing
So the Red Cross thing is pretty damning evidence, and it also seems to me that it shows that Karpinski, at least while she was there, at least to some degree, strikes me as having been a bit of a go along and get along, even if she was hardly culpable, and if she ultimately also did get screwed.
One thing that I think a lot of people are not aware of, maybe you can just talk to this point very briefly, is the time frame. It's a very, very short time frame that we're talking about for the whole sequence of events.
It's like, I noticed at some point that it was quite like the Rwandan Genocide. It was about 100 days. It's like these 3-month stories that seem to get their teeth in me. And it was a very short period of time. I mean, these guys arrived in the first 2 weeks of October. And in early January, the photographs were turned in by an MP named Joe Darby, who's widely credited as the whistleblower who turned these photographs over to CID investigators. The story, as I tell it in the book, is considerably more complicated. He was very overweight and had many years without being able to get a promotion because he couldn't pass the physical tests. And he also seems to have had emotional entanglements with Grainer, Lindy England, et cetera, that preyed on his mind. He had these photographs for 6 weeks, which even though he would say, I got the photographs when I came back from vacation on October 31st, basically, or November 31st, and I turned them in, at the beginning of, let's say December 1, and I turned them in on January 13. Just 2 weeks, I had the photographs. Come on, I mean, 4 weeks in December, last time I looked. 2 weeks before the 14th of January, 6 weeks he had them. Half the time that they were there for 3 months. So there's something complicated about it. He'd been shown photographs by Grainer within 2 weeks of arriving at the prison of a naked man, trussed and in a puddle. And Grainer said, the Christian in me knows it's wrong, but the prison guard in me can't help liking to make a grown man piss himself. Didn't seem to bother him all that much. And yet he turned in these pictures. And who he turned them into were a couple of CID agents who had been present during the dog torment scenes. So they knew perfectly well what was going on at the prison, and they'd actually been present at it, and they suddenly, like, I'm shocked, Claude Rains style, started investigating it. So something changed at that moment. And then the other thing which was pertinent to Janice Karpinski, in terms of her not having had real control over the prison had been placed, although prisons are supposed to be run by the military police, this prison had been placed under the control of the MI commander there, the military intelligence commander, Colonel Pappas, which is totally at odds with doctrine. And the entire operation had been placed under him. And he then issued, when this investigation began, a document that said, announcement of general amnesty. Now there's something called General Order Number 1, which is the rule like no pets, no porn, no drugs, no booze, no firearms, no antiquities, sort of just general rules for this combat theater that goes out to every soldier in the theater. And it says, if you have pets, porn, booze, or antiquities, or illegal firearms, we will put amnesty boxes out by your living areas, and you can put all that stuff in these amnesty boxes, and no offense, no foul. After 48 hours, we'll come through and investigate your kit, and if you don't have any of this stuff, everybody's clean. Right in the middle of that list was something that is not in General Order Number 1. It said like F, A, B, C, D, E, F. Pursuant to the Geneva Conventions, a document not much cited at Abu Ghraib, I should say, anybody with photographs of prisoners may also, it was like dispose of these pictures. Everybody, this jumped out like a, completely conspicuous red flag in the middle of this general order. And people were scrubbing hard drives and burning porn and pouring booze down the drain for the next 2 days. And there was never an investigation, nobody came around and inspected the kit. This is a cover-up order.
It's an incitement to
it's
destroy
basically,
evidence.
It's basically, and it's two things. It's saying destroy evidence and or shut up. If anybody comes to you and asks you about this stuff, you've just been advised that it's contraband and that you might not want to know that you had it. You might not want to talk about it. There were people who claimed, there was a guy named Sam Provence, I don't actually cite him in the book, but he talked about later when he went to be, he tried to tell stories about things that he'd heard when he was at Abu Ghraib that had disturbed him. When this investigation got going, he said, all right, I'll come forward and give you some evidence. And he starts telling them stories about abuses that he'd heard about. And he says that the investigators basically at a certain point leaned forward and said, are you telling me, soldier, that you were aware of abuses and you didn't report them at the time? Do you want to be put under oath for dereliction of duty? So the idea being not, thank you for coming clean and helping us our investigation, but if you're telling us a self-incriminating statement that you had knowledge, you failed to report. In other words, the pressure not to know, to cover up. A lot of people say it's a conspiracy, you know, oh, there's I don't think you need a conspiracy to make a bureaucracy like an army cover up. Everybody knows the cover your butt, CYA, cover your ass instinct, as they call it, is inherent in a bureaucracy. It's inherent in a system where everything is about how your guy above you and the guy below. If you make trouble, the guy above you is in trouble, therefore the guy above you is very interested in you not being in trouble. In a well-run system, that means he disciplines you. In a system where discipline is broken down, it means that you have mafia like Omerta. Everybody's just like burying everybody else's problems lest it becomes their problem.
Listen, we probably have time for another couple of questions. So,
sorry, I give long answers.
Yes.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is if you noticed in the interviews, in their narration, two things. If there was any sort of rehumanization of the Iraqi people in the retelling. I mean, if they started to realize a bit more on their side what was happening, and also was there any gratitude shown? Did you feel anything like that towards your Mr. Morris about listening, just listening without persecuting them? And then quickly, maybe you could comment. You said the sexualized nature of some of the photos was like less important than the fact that torture became a national policy. But I mean, maybe you've heard of pornography sites in the United States offering free access to soldiers who were putting up photos of things they had done in Iraq, patriotic acts that they'd done in Iraq. And I think it's a mistake to downplay the sexualized nature. I mean, it's so much has been written about that part of the military and the machismo, so maybe you could also comment on that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to downplay it. As I say, I mean, I think that the fact that this isn't just something we were doing to our foreign foe and antagonist and the terrorists, but that we were actually doing to our own soldiers. We look at these pictures and we say, well, is this the kind of image of ourselves that we want? Do we want to be projecting an image of ourselves as people who do this to others? We did this to ourselves too, and when I talk about what was being done to the American women soldiers as using them as instruments, I don't mean to be downplaying it. What I meant there is people got caught up in the idea that this was like the private kinkiness of a group of depraved soldiers involved in some kind of sexual play amongst themselves, and that distracted us, and it became a tabloid story. It became like Leash Girl and this and that and some sort of like S&M bizarrity that nobody really knew how to deal with it. All the that element, and it did distract us from the idea that this is not. It made it easier to think of it as a group of individuals rather than as a state policy. That's what I meant by it. But of course, that's a part of the state policy. Was that the two other questions? The first
Very
one.
quickly, please. Yeah.
Okay. The first one, which is, did they? Oh, well, at one point you asked, did they appreciate being able to tell their stories? They were conflicted. They rightly distrust the press. They've been made out, they've suffered greatly at the hands of the press, obviously. And yes, to some extent they wanted to tell their stories. To some extent they felt conflicted. And there was a first question. The rehumanization of the Iraqi prisoners. Yes and no. I mean, one of the interesting things that I noticed is that they kept telling stories about, well, we wailed on this guy for a few days, and then we found out he was the wrong guy. So the guy under the hood, in the famous picture being in the mock execution, Gilligan, the whole idea was that he was suspected of being a guy who'd been involved in killing American agents. Then they found out that he wasn't lying about his name. They just had the wrong guy. And they were like, okay, fine, Gilligan's a great guy. They liked him. They always said, Gilligan, he was a great guy. Really decent guy, Megan Ambule said. They made him, and what they did is with the people that they liked is they made them into their block wardens. They gave them cleaning duty. They let them feed the other guys. There are pictures of Grainer hanging around with Gilligan, arm around each other, smoking cigarettes and eating chicken. They made them, and they were, Sabrina Harmon said he was a really funny guy. If you had to take one of them home, that's the guy you would have brought home with you. So they didn't totally, the dehumanization and the humanization didn't require like some post-rehumanization. It was all simultaneous in some very muddled way. Like part of the story that's so uncomfortable, I think, is having to constantly take yourself away from these absolutely clear and condemnatory or good and bad positions and see this sort of coexistence of really opposing forces in these soldiers.
One more question, I think, probably. Well, gentleman here. I'll see if I can get you in.
You mentioned that this episode has already passed into history for a lot of people. To what extent is it an episode which is closed and which for a lot of people is reduced to the few bad apples in the barrel? And to what extent is there any chance of finding out what happened in Camp Namar, which is, you mentioned it earlier, any kind of calling to account of people higher up the chain of command in the administration?
It's an excellent question, and I mean, it's not a closed chapter. It is a closed chapter in many people's imagination, exactly. The official investigation of Abu Ghraib is over. There are no plans for further prosecution. During the trials, the court-martials, many of these soldiers and their legal lawyers sought to call people higher up the chain of command, and were told, no, you can't call them because they may face charges themselves, which they took as an encouraging discouragement because they thought, well, if those guys face charges, at least I can live with them. None of them will ever face charges. The highest person ever to be court-martialed was a lieutenant colonel, also a reservist, and although it was a bit of an ordeal for him, he came out sort of with the opposite of a wrist slap. He sort of had a prior wrist slap unslapped. He got unreprimanded. And so the question of higher up accountability and the investigation of many of the places where worse was happening, whether it's Camp Namar, whether it's the secret prisons that are not even in Iraq or Afghanistan, whether it's the accountability of people higher up the chain in the military or in the civilian leadership, that's an open question. I don't have overwhelming confidence that the way that our political system works is that the high and mighty will be rounded up and taken into the dock for war crimes charges. And I'm not sure if that would be the most productive way for us to move forward. It might have a chilling effect on the next guy who had such ideas, but I think we really have to face, what we need is an accounting. This story is something we've turned away from, largely because it's repellent, largely because it's frustrating. If you're somebody who found it appalling, there was a kind of political paralysis and depression over these years, a sense of helplessness that made it very hard. I think some people probably hope that like a new administration will mean it's all behind us. This national nightmare is over. I'm not sure that's true either. I think it's very hard to roll back license. It's a lot easier to grant it, and it will be hard to pull back from these things. One soldier said, we're now 4, 5, 6 tours or rounds of almost sort of military generations into this war on terror. The first group gets told we're taking the gloves off, and they get to a certain point. The next group comes in, and they're told we're taking the gloves off, but they're starting from where the other guy's gloves were. And it goes like that time after time after time. By the end, there's a new norm. And we're going to have to go, it's much harder to recreate those checks. And it's not clear that there's the political will in the country. It's not clear that it's a popular issue. The Democrats seem to have some fear that they're going to look weak on national security if they bring it up, which is scandalous. They should say that strength on national security means bringing an end to this policy of torture, that the war on terror is a war for global opinion as much as any military struggle, and that it can't be won with this image. But I think it'll take time, and I think we're still just getting started.
Just one more. Gentleman here, sir.
If you had had a chance to talk to these kids before they went out there, to a sort of hypothetical son of a friend that was going to be put in this circumstance, what would you say to them?
I'd say that all of these kids came back and said, my kids aren't going to join. They feel that their service was misused and that they were screwed for what they did, they feel very much that they were the victims of an injustice. They feel that their lives were messed around, that they were asked to do things. They're very traumatized. I mean, they're shaken by it. They have bad dreams, that kind of thing. That's not to say that they're the largest victims, but they are, they have not come out of this well either, for the most part. And I think what I would like to say is vote for the draft. In the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement was anti-draft. And, now it's the hawks are anti-draft. Because what we don't have in our country is any sense of civilian involvement, sacrifice, or, of having to consult the citizenry. And there's no stake for most people. And you have as I said at the very beginning, there's a military class and a military caste from whom these are drawn, for whom it's an honor, in a sense, to fight for one another. Soldiers always say that, right? We fight for, you're not really, you're fighting for your buddies right around you. So you become part of this group, and you expect that the civilian public doesn't understand you. And there are military families that are deeply distraught about this war. But if there were the sons and daughters of America at large being asked to keep this war going, it never would have started. You wouldn't have had an unaccountable war started. You wouldn't have had the level of bamboozlement. And I think national service would be a great idea without a war, too. It's the way, Norman Mailer met Texans, and many black civilians were integrated and became familiar to white civilians and vice versa. It's always been a way for the country actually to have a sense of itself as a country. And if you have a country that's disconnected from its own processes, you're much more likely to end up with the things that Eisenhower warned against in his military-industrial complex speech and all of that. So that's what I would tell them. I'd say, wait for the draft, then join. And do join, because if your country asks you to, you can always join and choose your wars.
Well, on that controversial note, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you very much indeed for coming along here tonight. It's a very, very interesting subject. I urge everybody here to read this book. It is a hard book to read, but it is very, very important. It raises many, many questions that have not really been looked at, despite the verbiage, the pages and pages of commentary on these photographs. It is a book that does not contain any of the photographs that has the most sense in it. So I urge you to that, and I urge you also to extend your thanks to Philip for coming along here tonight. Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you.